More than a decade ago, I made a video titled Lashawan Quadash, Ancient Hebrew. In 2015, Zion Lex re-uploaded my video onto his YouTube account. One of the first people to raise an objection in that regard happened to be a gentleman named Elazar Banloya, also known as Guerrilla Hebrew.
Zion Lex publishes a damn video, and in Zion Lex's video, he calls himself coming against the Lashawan Quadash founded in One West. He called himself rebutting that, trying to refute it, using basically plagiarized information. Be original, homie. Please. Because that was plagiarized information.
I was browsing Vocab Malone's Facebook forum, which is dedicated to Hebrew Israelite and Christian debate and discussion and dialogue. And there was a post in there from Vocab noting that the Sakari group was doing a live review of video footage of Vocab's recent interaction with another Israelite group called One Body in Yahweh Shai. Apparently, during the course of the review of the exchange, the Sakari group received some criticism in the video live chat from still another Israelite group known as Israelites Tried and Refined. And so Elazar Banloya took a break from his review of the exchange between Vocab and One Body and Yahweh Shai to offer some counter-criticism to this group, which had apparently been criticizing his group.
Another group of Christians have to get exposed today, not just Vocab and them. The guys who call themselves Israelites Tried and Refined. We call them their proper name. It's called Israelites Tried and Refuted, because we've refuted them through the spirit and power of Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahweh Shai so many times. And if what we're teaching is wormwood and dogma, right, why do you still stay Yahweh in Yahweh Shai? Why do you still say that? Because that you got that from the same guys that taught you everything else that you said was wrong. Yet you still follow their form of Hebrew.
As Israelites Tried and Refined is a group which splintered off from Great Millstone. So, and apparently since breaking away from Great Millstone, they've rejected some of the things which they were taught by the Great Millstone group, such as, for example, the 12 tribe sign. So Elazar Banloya was pointing out that they still, despite rejecting some GMS doctrines, they still hold on to Lashawan Quadash. So Elazar was asking, if they now reject the teachings of GMS, of Great Millstone, why do they still hold on to Lashawan Quadash? I find that question very interesting because it seems to come very close to positing or tacitly assuming that it's not possible to reach a conclusion in favor of Lashawan Quadash on one's own, like after an examination of the available evidence. Rather, it has to be inherited from another group. Very similar to a statement which Tahar, the leader of GMS, himself had made in December of 2017.
So all you guys that left GMS or got kicked out or whatever the case may be, you guys still call on the name of Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahweh Shai, which you got from us. The spirit didn't come down. Hey, a man in a gray suit didn't come in your kitchen and tell you the Most High's name is Yahweh and his son's name is Yahweh Shai. You got that from us and you believed it through faith that was his name. You guys still keep your same ancient Hebrew names, the Lashawan Quadash. You still say Hebrew words in the Lashawan or the so-called Lashawan Quadash. All right, whether it's made up or not, according to a Vocab Malone, you got that from us and you believed it through faith.
In the first clip I played from 2015, Elazar described Lashawan Quadash as founded at One West and rediscovered by One West. While others might take a different view, I interpret that as likely meaning that he believes one would not have Lashawan Quadash were it not for the Israeli Church of Universal Practical Knowledge, which was at 1 West 125th Street in Manhattan. It also seems to potentially entail that no one would know of the system, or no one knew of the system of pronunciation before One West brought it out. Meanwhile, in the clip from Tahar, he rather flatly says that former members of his group accepted Lashawan Quadash on faith. And Al-Azhar likewise seems to think that former members of GMS who still hold the Lashawan Quadash simply received that system from GMS, which is to say he does not seem to think they arrived at that conclusion after their own personal examination of the evidence. The Sakari Public Enemies account aired a video in which Al-Azhar Banloya and another member of his group reviewed Vocab Malone's exchange with GMS Dallas from a little over a week ago. It's a nearly 3-hour video titled Vocab Malone versus GMS, Sakari Live Reaction, It's a Situation. It's actually the first part of a 3-part series which they made on the subject of Vocab and GMS Dallas. And at about the 1 hour, 41-minute mark of this video, of this first part, they devote some time to Vocab's argument against Lashawan Quadash.
But the answer of a good person right there by the resurrection of Yahweh HaMashiach. So you can.
Why you change the words of the Bible, my friend?
All you want.
Why can't you change the words of the Bible? Stop. It doesn't say Yahweh Shai.
That's his name.
Okay.
Okay, so then why'd you go and ask brother from one body, Bishop Jephthah, about Paraclete?
Right.
But they did say Paraclete, they say Holy Spirit, nigga.
Yeah, you damn hypocrite. You're the
devil.
devil. You are the devil.
He's a devil, man.
When Vocab had his exchange with the group called One Body and Yahweh Shai, which was the day after he had his exchange with GMS Dallas, at one point in their discussion, he used the term Paraclete, which the bishop of that group was unfamiliar with. And since then, some have poked a little fun at the way the man expressed his unfamiliarity with the term. To clarify, Vocab was asking the question because he was under the impression that the bishop might be conflating Christ and the Holy Spirit. And Vocab himself made clear that by Paraclete, he was referring to the Holy Spirit.
In John, doesn't Jesus say he's going to send the Paraclete, who's the Holy Spirit? Doesn't he say that?
Who is that?
Doesn't Jesus say he's
Tell
going
me
to send the
who is
Paraclete?
that since you're saying it.
The Holy Spirit is a distinct person.
Vocab was not using the word Paraclete in place of the phrase Holy Spirit. Rather, he was using Paraclete instead of the word Comforter, as found in the 14th and 16th chapters of the Gospel of John in the King James Version, as well as earlier translations. The reason why is because the Greek term is parakletos. Paraclete is an old anglicization of that Greek term. Now, to be fair to Vocab, he spends a lot of time in Muslim-Christian debate. He's been exploring the subject of Islam far longer than he has been exploring the subject of One West Israelism. And he's more well known for his videos on Islam than he is for his videos on Israelites. Now, I think that's worth mentioning because the word Paraclete is very, very common in Muslim-Christian dialogue. So while I would agree that there's no shame in the one body bishop not being familiar with the term, it is a common term in Vocab's experience, and thus one can understand why he might initially have been surprised that someone with a long history of debating the Bible was unfamiliar with it. The word Paraclete, the English word Paraclete, appears in a translation of the Bible which predates the King James Bible, that being the Douay-Rheims, and in fact it appears in specifically that translation's New Testament, which was published by itself in 1582 in Reims, or Reims as the city is called in French, nearly 30 years before the King James Bible was published. In fact, the original Douay-Rheims had a marginal note at John 14:16 explaining why it employs the word Paraclete. It reads as follows, quote, Paraclete, by interpretation, is either a comforter or an advocate, and therefore to translate it by any one of them only is perhaps to abridge the sense of this place. End quote. The term is very common in the circles that Vocab has moved in, and second, the term has been part of the English language since before the publishing of the King James Bible, so it's been part of the English language for quite a while. So the point is that Vocab using the word Paraclete in place of the Greek parakletos is fair and not exactly analogous to one Westers using the much more recent fringe innovation Yahweh Shai in place of Jesus or Yeshua or even the English Jesus. I mean, ironically, even if we treat the English pronunciation Jesus as only roughly 400 years old or so, that would still be centuries older than our earliest reference to Yahweh Shai. But All that aside, vocab wasn't really complaining merely about diverging from a given translation, as surely he's fine with the idea that words have semantic ranges which can be expressed in a variety of ways. The issue here is that one Westers think Yahushai is the one and only correct rendering of Christ's name, and vocab was alluding to the fact that that rendering is unjustified, as it's rooted in the unfounded modern system of pronunciation started by One West called Lashawan Quadash, and it's also contrary to what is implied by the text itself.
Jesus didn't speak Lashawan Quadash?
Well, here's my question, vocab. You said what? Here's my question, vocab. Can you prove to me that there were vowel points that were employed in the day-to-day communications of ancient Israelites during that time period? If you can't, then you can't substantiate that the Lashawan Quadash was not being spoken.
Vowel points would be employed in written text, and therefore wouldn't be employed in spoken speech and, in audible conversation. But whatever the case, if he means did these vowel points, which we see, the diacritical marks, the dots and dashes, the nikodot, that we see in the Masoretic text, did that exist in the time of Jesus? No, it did not exist. Those diacritical marks, those symbols, had not yet been created. But that's actually relevant to vocab's point, because while the symbols, diacritical marks representing those vocalizations did not exist.
Are you ready?
How can you prove that? I would love to see this nigga prove that.
He can prove it by showing recordings which imply that Jesus employed vocalizations which are not part of Lashawan Quadash.
None of you standing here will be able to answer. So what I'm saying is, why did you cut off God's word? Now here's what I'll show you. Matthew 26, Matthew 27, I'm sorry, verses 47. You guys ready?
Oh, God.
Jesus cried out with a loud voice.
Eli. I knew he was going to do it.
I think he did make that prediction in his mind, that he anticipated it. And the reason why is because the argument has been around for as long as Al-Azhar has been involved in the One West Israelite spectrum. And it's also come up in videos which Al-Azhar is, I'm sure, familiar with. It was in my video from 2009, which was the first video ever online to be critical of Lashawan Quadash. Moreover, in the summer of 2016, when vocab was really starting to explode onto the scene, onto the Israelite scene, thanks in part to his appearances on James White's Dividing Line, as well as the debate that he managed to set up between James White and Rachash Shayar of Gathering of Christ Church, GOCC. Around that same time, in June of 2016, vocab himself had James White play the very same video on James White's show on the Dividing Line.
So this video, I think we're going to show a clip of.
Right.
It's a little brief exposure of how they came to speak the Hebrew they speak. They believe it's the pure, the holy tongue, not modern day Masoretic influenced Yiddish.
Trace your beliefs.
There he is.
The Lashawan Quadash is purely from, I can't see it, the imagination of High Priest
Arya. So he gets into a place in Matthew where he's saying it provides evidence against these claims. Pretty interesting. So you can see he did a super bang-up job on this video, in my opinion, just the level of detail.
Matthew 20. I got to see this. How does Matthew 20? Okay, bring it up. Come on. This is the Greek text of Jesus' cry on the cross, according to which implies a very specific Hebrew phrase. Yeah, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. In other words, the Greek transliteration captures the pronunciation. That's true. Lama, Eli, Eli. Yeah, and it would not have. It is no different from the opening line of Psalm 22, save the fact that it employs the Aramaic. Went too fast, sorry. Note that Eli is pronounced Eli and not Alaya, which is true. Note the final character Yod is pronounced E, not Yah. Thus, in the first century, Hebrew characters had multiple vocalizations. Vocalizations which opponents of Lashawan Quadash claim are incorrect. Most importantly, it shows that Jesus did not speak Lashawan Quadash. Well, that was probably a given. The New Testament predates the time of the Masoretes by many centuries, but we can go back further still and consider the transliterations in the Septuagint, a pre-Christian era translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Only one criticism
right.
of the video. Why keep that music on?
I think it was so God, before the foundations of the world were laid, could give James White a chance to spit some bars.
I don't think so.
I do believe that Al-Azhar has long been familiar with this argument. I think many One Westers, many who have been within One West for a long time, have been familiar with the argument. Unfortunately, I feel that no one has really grappled with it for all these years. It hasn't been adequately addressed.
That doesn't prove anything. Matthew was taken from Hebrew into Greek and then transliterated back. You're dealing with a double transliteration. That does not substantiate the actual vocalization of what actually came out of Yahweh's mouth during the time of that. It doesn't do it. Nice try though. A double, triple transliteration. He's trying to use that. That doesn't work. When you think we were born yesterday, man, literally it went from Hebrew to Greek, right? Back into English and then into Hebrew that way. That's crazy.
The English is not relevant here. I know that vocab appealed to the English somewhat, but that's because he was dealing with a crowd that works on English. But at the same time, he also appealed back to the Greek text. And the Greek text is simply a transliteration of Christ's statement. This sort of appeal to personal incredulity does not really explain why this ancient writer transliterated it that way. Even if you say that he was transliterating a piece of written Hebrew, it still begs the question, why did this ancient writer look at Aleph, Lamed, Yod and conclude that it was pronounced Eli, unless that was the ancient understanding of how the word my God was pronounced at that time? Suppose you have the string of characters Aleph, Lamed, Yod. We would say that word, meaning my God, is pronounced Eli. Proponents of Lashawan Quadash would say that that word is pronounced Aliyah. But here's the issue. We have ancient transliterations corroborating the view that it's pronounced Eli. The proponents of Lashawan Quadash have no ancient transliterations corroborating their view regarding what they think it's pronounced as Aliyah.
Now, that's a transliteration of what Jesus said on the cross.
Aliyah, Aliyah.
In Lashawan Quadash, should you say, my God?
Aliyah.
In right.
Aliyah.
Right. But what did Jesus actually say? My God. The transliteration is Eli, not Aliyah.
It wouldn't be transliterated like that.
Why did they transliterate it that way?
That's what El is. El missed that point. El is Allah. The transliteration. No, speaking real Hebrew. That's not Aliyah Hebrew. You just got cut again. Hebrew. Here's the problem. What's real Hebrew? What Jesus spoke. What Jesus spoke. Sure. What's German have to do with it? Okay, I'm just trying. What's German have to do with it?
Well, because you're German, you Nazi. You're German, you Nazi. One, but what's being spoke now is Yiddish. Granted, you have what they call biblical Hebrew that's not exactly Yiddish, but it's not the ancient Hebrew. And Benjamin Netanyahu went on record saying that Christ did not speak the same thing that they speak in their time in Israel now. They didn't.
There's been what I feel is an unfair shift in the focus or a misrepresentation of vocab's argument. He wasn't arguing for modern Israeli Hebrew. Rather, he was focusing on the language that Jesus spoke and how that measures up against Lashawan Quadash. I seriously doubt that vocab believes that Jesus spoke specifically modern Israeli Hebrew. So the argument is not for modern Israeli Hebrew, rather the argument is against Lashawan Quadash. For example, later on, vocab makes an appeal to the Septuagint. The Septuagint corroborates some of the pronunciations in modern Israeli Hebrew, but it does not corroborate all of them. In some places, the Septuagint transliterations imply an older form of Hebrew, which in some respects, in some pronunciations, is closer to Arabic, has more phonemes than modern Israeli Hebrew does. So again, the argument that's being put forth is not designed to somehow prop up the entirety of modern Israeli Hebrew. Rather, it's simply being used to show that Lashawan Quadash is not ancient Hebrew. You have to understand that this isn't some sort of a simple dichotomy where either it's modern Israeli Hebrew or Lashawan Quadash wins by default or vice versa.
I'm in the Bible right right now. Why are you going to Germany for? Let's go back to here. He says Eli, Eli, which is Eli, Eli. Why doesn't he say what Jesus said? No, it's not. You don't have an E sound in your fake language. There's no E sound. Okay, do you have an E sound?
Prove to me there's an E sound in Hebrew at all without them dots. If you don't have them dots next to those letters, you don't know to make any of those sounds. When were those dots added to those letters? Who are the Masoretes?
Vocab has already demonstrated that with his appeals to the New Testament and also to his appeal to the Septuagint and so forth. Now, the question might be, how so? Here's how so. What we see is that centuries before the Masoretes, we have all these different sources that show these same vocalizations, that show a recognition of these vocalizations. So let's focus on the eh sound, this idea that when the string of characters, Aleph Lamed, in reference to a god, is pronounced El, that this was pronounced El before the Masoretes. We have evidence of that. We have it in the transliterations in the Septuagint. We have evidence of it in the transliterations in the New Testament. And we could go to other sources, such as the transliterations in Josephus and the writings of Philo and so on. It's very, very clear that many centuries before the time of the Masoretes, people were already vocalizing this word in that way. So vocab has already demonstrated it, that this was the way it was pronounced in the time of Jesus. Aside from that, the next question which Al-Azhar asked touches on a bit of a complex subject, especially vis-a-vis trying to convey these things to proponents of Lashawan Quadash. So listen to this next question.
How did Israelites talk before those things were introduced to their language?
As we already covered, the vocalizations implied by the pointed text of the Masoretic text long predated the introduction of those diacritical marks, of those dots and dashes. Now, by the same token, while we don't have transliterations predating the somewhat speculative mater lectionis, it's nonetheless the case that we don't have any reason to think that the introduction of this writing convention brought about a significant change in pronunciation, as was the case with the pointed text and the Masoretic text. We could say so too with the mater lectionis, that they were introducing a writing convention to reflect vocalizations that already existed, rather than proposing this idea where people were all talking one way and they changed the way they wrote, and suddenly the way they spoke somehow changed to correspond to the writing. It seems to make more sense to me that the writing introduces these new conventions to reflect already existing vocalizations, to clarify their vocalizations.
No, you still got to translate it to the actual.
That's a total cut.
If anything, it provides yet another example in support of his position. For those who don't know, they were referring to the transliteration of a Hebrew word which appears in Revelation 9:11. The relevant word is a biblical Hebrew term, which is to say it can be found in the Hebrew Bible. The Masoretic text renders that word as Abaddon. There's an O vocalization in there, so it is a vocalization which is contrary to Lashawan Quadash. But did the Masoretes introduce that vocalization? No, they did not. As centuries before the Masoretes, the book of Revelation likewise transliterated it Abaddon.
So yeah.
That's right.
Yes, or Aleph Lamek Yod. You're right. But guess what? It still doesn't make Eli.
While Al-Azhar declares that Aleph Lamed Yod cannot produce Eli, he nonetheless has yet to explain why this ancient text transliterated it that way. It seems that the ancient writer understood that string of characters to be pronounced in precisely that way.
That's right.
Where did the vowel?
Yeah.
Where did your vowels come from?
Hold on. Well, if I look in the ancient writings of Hebrew, I don't see vowels.
If by vowels Al-Azhar means the dots and dashes of the Masoretic text, the nikud, the nikudot, if that's what he means, by this point it should be obvious that those symbols are not required to vocalize the text in that way. The symbols represent vocalizations that existed before those symbols were developed. That's the key point here. This ancient text is clearly showing that the word was vocalized that way in the time of Christ.
Where you get your pronunciation. Listen. Okay, look. So you got the Masoretes, right? They were a group of Jewish.
Bro, this is before the Masoretes.
No, it's not. No, it's not, because those vowels were not there.
With all due respect to Al-Azhar, while he's saying, no, it's not, honestly, the response is, I'm sorry, but yes, it is. We're referring to a transliteration in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Matthew, that is before the Masoretes. Matthew was written before the time of the Masoretes.
Hold on, who worked between the 6th and the 10th century?
I know this
Based
argument.
primarily in the
Rakam tried to use this. We know.
Tiberias, Jerusalem, as well as Iraq. Each group compiled a system.
codex to do the kings.
You know how you're wrong?
Each group compiled
Read
a
the
system
Septuagint.
of pronunciation and grammatical guides
I know.
in the form of diacritical notes.
Brother, read the Septuagint. When it translates into Hebrew, it lets you know how it's spoken.
No, the Septuagint does not let you know that.
Actually, the Septuagint does provide a number of transliterations which are relevant to questions about Hebrew pronunciation, and we'll get to that in a moment.
Still isn't Paleo, ancient, pre-exilic Hebrew. That's the point, vocab.
I'm sensing another shift in focus here. Note that vocab, when he started this out, he started out as a question about whether or not Jesus spoke Lashawan Quadash, while now Al-Azhar is talking about pre-exilic Hebrew. This raises an interesting question. Does Al-Azhar believe that the Hebrew spoken by Jesus, by Christ, was fundamentally different from the Hebrew spoken in pre-exilic times? That's an interesting question. But if his answer is no, that Jesus was speaking essentially the same language that, or roughly similar language to what was spoken in pre-exilic times, then we would be able to get a sense, within the paradigm of that assumption, we would get a sense of what pre-exilic Hebrew was like, because we have a sense of what Hebrew was like in the time of Christ. And that's the issue here. But let's consider the other alternative. Let's suppose Al-Azhar says, well, actually, Hebrew in the time of Christ was fundamentally different from pre-exilic Hebrew. Okay, working within that paradigm, it seems to be that his assumption is that in pre-exilic times they were speaking Lashawan Quadash, even though there's no evidence for that, but in the time of Christ they weren't. That would beg the question, if people weren't speaking Lashawan Quadash in the time of Christ, why do you refer to him by a Lashawan Quadash name? Wouldn't it be the case that in his time nobody was calling him quote-unquote Yahushai? Wouldn't that be the case if people weren't speaking Lashawan Quadash then?
Well, I'm supposed to just trust the Greek Septuagint, the source that
Something
our
that
people
cried about
had
the-
days of mourning because of how poorly it was translated when you go into the history.
I think, with all due respect to these gentlemen, they're being a bit too flippant. Nonetheless, even if you have disagreements with the way certain texts were translated, that doesn't lead to the conclusion that these men, the translators of the Septuagint, didn't know how Hebrew characters were pronounced. Their transliterations show an ancient understanding of how various Hebrew words were pronounced. And so I want to take a look at the Septuagint to show the significance of this fact. Let me show my Septuagint. We'll take my Septuagint off the shelf and we'll take a look in here. We're going to take a look at some of the transliterations that appear in this text. So first, let's go to 1 Chronicles chapter 6. You have the name Asir, which is spelled with an aleph. It starts with aleph. And so here it is right here, Asir. It's spelled with an aleph, yet it's transliterated with an alpha. Yet in the same verse, or the verse before, you have Elkanah, also spelled with an aleph, yet it's transliterated with an epsilon. Now, let's go to 2 Samuel, and where you have the name Ishtob, also spelled with an aleph, yet transliterated with an iota. Aside from that, let's jump to Genesis 36, where you have the name Omar, right? Omar, spelled with an aleph, transliterated with an omega. And let's jump back to 1 Chronicles chapter 6 again, and you have the name Uriel, spelled with an aleph, but transliterated with an omicron upsilon. Think about the implications of what was just shown. We have 5 different biblical terms, all starting with aleph, yet that initial character is transliterated 5 different ways. And this touches on a central point here. One major premise of Lashawan Quadash is that each Hebrew character has essentially only one possible vocalization. Meanwhile, the standard understanding of Hebrew, along with other Semitic languages like Arabic and Aramaic, posits that each Hebrew character has multiple possible vocalizations. The ancient transliterations that we just looked at provide clear examples of such. We see that in the ancient understanding, the aleph was not simply pronounced ah, rather it could be vocalized alternatively as ah, e, o, u, and we can show a similar spectrum for the other characters. Now, Al-Azhar wishes to voice his disapproval of the Septuagint, but we see a similar spectrum of vocalizations also appearing in the New Testament, in the writings of Josephus, and in the writings of Philo. Thus, we have a collection of ancient evidence in favor of the conclusion that, in the time of Christ, the Hebrew language had a spectrum of vocalizations which proponents of Lashawan Quadash claim were not part of Hebrew. Now, to be clear, this is not an argument in favor of modern Israeli Hebrew. However, it is an argument against Lashawan Quadash. I would put it this way. We have evidence, ancient evidence, in favor of a standard understanding of ancient Hebrew. Meanwhile, Lashawan Quadash has no evidence in its favor.
Let me show you what happened. Let me show you what really happened in real life. The Nazarites made the sounds for what the Hebrews were already speaking.
No. Well, now he just unvalidated his own argument because he's trying to say, no, that's not true with the Masoretes. But now you're saying that the Masoretes had it right, but they just introduced the vowel points. How do you go about substantiating that?
It has been substantiated, it has been demonstrated that the vocalizations we see appearing in the Masoretic text predated the Masoretic text insofar that many of those same vocalizations appear in ancient transliterations which were written centuries before the time of the Masoretes. So therefore, vocab is correct. The Masoretes didn't just introduce a whole bunch of new vocalizations to the Hebrew language. Rather, these vocalizations already existed, and the Masoretes introduced symbols, dots and dashes, which represented already existing vocalizations.
Do this. Instead of jumping around, defend Ariya's invention of Lashawan Quadash. Do you know how these recorded?
Quadash. Quadash is something different. You're playing the game. And you know it. If you know the Hebrew, you know he's playing the game.
I'm actually glad that Al-Azhar touched on this because it gives me an opportunity to briefly discuss something that people have asked me about. When I transliterate the phrase Lashawan Quadash, I often, but not always, transliterate Quadash, Q-U-A. And so some have given me a hard time about that. Why are you putting a U in there when there's no U in Lashawan Quadash? And I do it just to convey, to make it more clear how the proponents of this system pronounce that word. However, in other cases, I might leave the U out just because, for the sake of search engines, because everyone else who uses this system transliterates it without that U. Nonetheless, in vocab's defense, yes, he's pronouncing it Kadash, and proponents of Lashawan Quadash pronounce it Quadash, but in his defense, when people are consistently transliterating it without the U, it's sort of natural to just pronounce it Kadash, right? It's just that's sort of a natural inclination, and it winds up being a mistake that even long-time proponents of Lashawan Quadash make in certain settings. Like, for example, take a look at Rakah from GMS. Listen to the way he pronounces the word Quadarwa, which should be Quadarwa, according to their system of pronunciation here.
Jeremiah 14:2. I know you guys know the Hebrew. Judah mourneth, and the gates thereof languish. They are black unto the ground. Right here in the Hebrew, right? What's the word? What's the word? Black in the Hebrew, right? Okay. Qadarwa. In Hebrew, you read that. What does that word say? What does that word mean?
It means a couple of things. It means became dark, or became very sad, angry.
Sad?
Yes.
What does it mean?
Dark skin.
It means dark skin. Qadarwa. The word Qadarwa means to be dark skin. So darker they onto the earth.
I've even seen Mitzilel Merafai, who, by the way, I consider to be the perhaps the most brilliant critic of Lashawan Quadash around today, at least that I know of, and I would certainly recommend to anyone interested his Facebook page, where he tackles fringe alternatives to Hebrew, or fringe alternative forms of Hebrew, not just Lashawan Quadash, but also this whole Eve position and other alternatives as well. And he does so from the position of someone who's done serious study in Semitic languages. Anyway, what I was saying is I've seen even Mitzilel, who's been a critic of Lashawan Quadash for years, I've seen even him sort of fall into this tendency to say Quadash, you know. I think it sort of comes naturally for people who have studied Hebrew, you know, to not think of this character as Qua. You know, that honestly, let's be honest, only a person thinking within a purely English paradigm would render that character Qua, because, you know, in English, almost every word that starts with Q or involves a Q is pronounced qua, like quiet, quest, quote, quota, etc. You know, it's very rare to see an English word with a Q and not with that sort of UW sound immediately after it. You know, it's a function of the fact that Lashawan Quadash was created in an almost monolingual environment. So I hope it can be forgiven that certain people slip up and refer to it as Quadash, or pronounce the character Ka instead of Qua, as was just seen. Even long-time proponents of Lashawan Quadash make that mistake on occasion. Whatever the case, this is, as I said earlier, this is precisely the reason why I transcribe it with a U, Q-U-A, Quadash, to convey this fact about the system of pronunciation to those who are reading about it.
Is the whole an angelic vision that Moses spoke still on earth today? Identical, no. So it's not.
You're cut. You're cut. You're cut. You're cut. You're cut. Oh, this nigga is cut, bro.
The question was Hebrew in the time of Moses the same as the way it is today? And Vocab said no. How is that a problem for Vocab's position? Yes, modern Israeli Hebrew is different from ancient forms of Hebrew. That's not a controversial position. And the only way you could think that's a cut is if you're arguing against a straw man in which Vocab was trying to argue that modern Israeli Hebrew is identical to the Hebrew that Jesus spoke, which is clearly not his position. That was never his position. So, you know, to say that modern Israeli Hebrew differs from biblical Hebrew or differs from the Hebrew that was used in the time of Jesus, that in no way causes a problem for the position that people in the time of Christ were not speaking Lashawan Quadash. It's possible to affirm both A, modern Israeli Hebrew is different from ancient Hebrew, and B, ancient evidence works against Lashawan Quadash, and Lashawan Quadash has no evidence in its favor. So I honestly don't see how that's a cut. With all due respect to Al-Azhar, I think this may be indicative of a misunderstanding on his part.
So when did the languages change over time? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Okay, but what I'm saying is the Lashawan Quadash, it ain't changed.
I disagree with Al-Azhar even on this point. Ironically, even though almost no one uses Lashawan Quadash, it has still managed to evolve in the short time that it has existed. Consider first, and I'm going to give a few examples, but consider first a clip of a person who knew Bibbins, and this person recounting how the language was when Bibbins was still alive.
Then I learned Derek Abbott. Derek Abbott is the one that Abba used to teach us.
Like Shalom, how they speak like that?
It was you know, instead of saying Shalom, they say Shalama.
Shalom.
They say Barakata, you know. And you know, it was you know, Abba told me that he was reading the Tanakh one time, you know, and some man appeared in his kitchen in a gray suit. I said, yeah, you sure? He said, yeah, and this man showed him how to read it. And that's why he called it Derek Abbott. But I didn't like it, you know. But I learned it too, but we don't use it.
Notice how the gentleman said that back in Bibbin's time they would say Shalama. Now, those who have been following One West's development since the 90s know that throughout the 90s they consistently said shalom. However, now it's becoming more and more common for people to say shalom, and you can find proponents of shalom and shalom disagreeing with each other online. This is certainly believable that they may have once said shalama, because think about how consistently the word for Israel has been Yashar Allah. But there's people now who say Yashar Al. And while one might say, oh, well, the people who say Yashar Al, they changed it, it nonetheless relates to the question of how do you know when to vocalize the last character and when to leave it unvocalized? Now, Arya sort of developed an arbitrary system where he has the connectors and the disconnectors, the thing that looks like a smiley face and the thing that looks like a frown. And can we at least admit that this is something that was introduced by Arya? It's his own form of diacritics. And that in itself would be a bit of evidence of the language evolving, in this very short span of time, that even Arya is introducing his own diacritical marks. It's also interesting to see how proponents of Lashawan Quadash use the system on social media. I remember once seeing a post where someone shared some artwork that they had made, and a friend of his replied, Zacham, ach. That's a minor example, but it is clearly an example of a person recasting Lashawan Quadash terms in a modern American English matrix, as he was clearly trying to say, that's hot, Zacham. There are serious linguists who, when writing about modern Israeli Hebrew, have noted that while much of the vocabulary and many of the grammatical structures are Hebrew, because the language was quickly adopted by large numbers of Yiddish speakers and large numbers of English speakers, day-to-day speech in modern Israeli Hebrew unwittingly produces lots of examples of Semitic terminology being plugged into a sort of Germanic syntax. I mention that because I think the declaration Zacham, ach, is a similar phenomenon. And I know someone might say, well, that's just something on social media, but we see this in allegedly more learned contexts. An example of this came up in the recent controversy between GMS and the older gentleman known as Harab, where Harab was trying to talk about his past as a Rastafarian and trying to do so within Lashawan Quadash. He was using Lashawan Quadash to recount his past, and the GMS elders, including Arayam Lab, who's supposedly the lexicon of GMS's resident linguist, the GMS elders, not actually knowing the language they promote, misunderstood what Harab was saying and wrongly took it as him endorsing Rastafarianism in the present day. But putting the misunderstandings of GMS aside, I'd like to focus on a key statement at the center of the controversy to explore its grammar. As you watch this, keep in mind that a number of One Westers apparently consider this gentleman to be the closest thing to an expert in Lashawan Quadash. Recall that when the man said, quote, Anya Kwara'a Alahayam Haile Selassie, end quote, he was trying to say, quote, I used to call God Haile Selassie. He was trying to say that he used to call God Haile Selassie. So he's referring to something from his past. Now, I want to focus on that phrase, those two words, Anya Kwara'a, putting aside disagreements about pronunciation. Is that not obviously a first-person singular pronoun with a third-person singular past tense rendering of the verb? And a quick disclaimer, and confess that I wanted to say perfect tense as per biblical Hebrew, but I say past tense instead, as that's how I've seen it taught by proponents of Lashawan Quadash who attempt to teach verb conjugations. If it's the case that Anya Kwaraya is a first-person singular pronoun with a third-person singular past tense rendering of the verb, doesn't it seem obvious that he was using Lashawan Quadash terms but still thinking in English? Isn't it obvious that he was merely plugging Lashawan Quadash terms into an English framework? Wouldn't the first-person past tense rendering of the relevant verb in Lashawan Quadash pronunciation be Kwara'athia? As you contemplate the proper way to say I called past tense in Lashawan Quadash, give some thought to the point that modern Lashawan Quadash is following a similar pattern to what occurs in instances of popular modern Israeli Hebrew speech, where the Semitic elements are entered into an essentially Germanic matrix. Aside from the evolution of pronunciation, vocalization, syntax, grammar, there's also the evolution of vocabulary, which should be obvious. But Tahar actually gave a humorous example, and I actually remember this because I saw once, many, many years ago, more than a decade ago, I got to see some class notes relevant to Lashawan Quadash as taught at One West. Somebody had saved it, and within that, it offered the ancient Hebrew word, the Lashawan Quadash word for television. And so it's interesting to have Tahar remembering this as well.
I remember when Ariel taught the Hebrew, and there were certain words, like the word for television, they would kind of say it in a Hebrew sounding way. I'm trying to think of some words that they use that are not actually Hebrew words.
Unfortunately, Tahar didn't share what the word was for television. I myself don't remember it, but I do remember seeing it in a piece of paper more than a decade ago. I also remember there was a word for fork, which I found curious, an ancient Hebrew word for fork, but, like a fork that you used to eat with. But I guess I don't remember that either. But one thing I do remember was within the numbers. I remember as recently as 2005, someone showed me the class notes from 1941 Madison for Lashawan Quadash, and they were teaching the numbers. I don't know if other schools are also doing this, other groups are doing this, but when they were teaching the numbers, they went all the way up to 1,000,000. And the Lashawan Quadash word for million was Malayawan. Now, it should be obvious what that is. That's a loan word from English, or Latin, I guess, but a loan word from outside of Hebrew being recast into a Lashawan Quadash pronunciation. Million Malayawan. That's for real. So the point that I'm making is that Lashawan Quadash, despite being spoken by a very small number of people, is clearly evolving. The pronunciations are evolving, the vocalizations are evolving, whether or not it has diacritical marks has evolved. That's something that was introduced. The grammar is evolving, the syntax is evolving, and even the vocabulary is evolving, and that should be obvious. Now, I mean, if this is the case with such a small group, imagine if you had millions of people speaking it as a first language, what would be the Lashawan Quadash word for platypus or kangaroo? Or how would you discuss quantum mechanics or the engine of an automobile in Lashawan Quadash? I mean, languages have to naturally evolve. So this language that One Westers promote isn't spoken by anybody, but it still manages to evolve a little bit in the short time and space that it's existed in. If it actually was spoken by millions of people, it would evolve to a significantly greater degree.